What if giving up your only weapon of survival seals your fate? He ruled for 42 years, feared, flamboyant, and untouchable. In secret, he chased the ultimate weapon, a nuclear deterrent to protect his reign. Then in 2003, he shocked the world. He gave it all up. The West applauded, sanctions lifted, oil flowed. And Gaddafi? He was reborn as a global statesman, or so it seemed. But beneath the smiles and handshakes, Libya was a pressure cooker. And in 2011, it exploded. As rebel forces closed in, NATO jets roared overhead, and Gaddafi had no deterrent left. Would history have changed if he hadn't disarmed, captured, humiliated, killed in the dirt? The same man who gave up nukes was left exposed when it mattered most. The world watched. Pyongyang learned. Tehran took notes. Never give up your nukes became the new mantra. This is the story of disarmament, betrayal, and a dictator's fatal mistake. Why did Gaddafi give up his nuclear program? Did the West betray the deal? What does this mean for Iran, North Korea, and the future of global security? Watch till the end for the chilling legacy that still haunts the world stage. In the early 2000s, Libya stood at a crossroads. Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, who seized power in 1969, had ruled for decades with a mix of revolutionary rhetoric, oil wealth, and iron-fisted control. He promoted his own Green Book ideology as an alternative system of governance, cultivating an image as both an eccentric visionary and a feared autocrat. Yet behind the flamboyance and heavy-handed rule, Gaddafi was quietly pursuing weapons of mass destruction, including a clandestine nuclear weapons program. This pursuit dated back to the 1970s, as Gaddafi sought regional prestige and a deterrent against enemies. For years, Libya's nuclear ambitions far outstripped its technical capabilities. But Gaddafi was determined to acquire the ultimate weapon to secure his regime's survival and influence. Libya's nuclear quest was long on ambition, but short on know-how. From the 1970s onward, Gaddafi's regime tried repeatedly to jumpstart a nuclear weapons program. Lacking domestic expertise, Libya became heavily reliant on foreign assistance and the nuclear black market. By the late 1990s, Western intelligence agencies were tracking suspicious shipments of nuclear technology into Libya. Notably, the Pakistani scientist Abdul Qadir Khan, infamous for selling nuclear secrets, had provided Libya with uranium enrichment centrifuges and even a blueprint for a nuclear warhead. Dozens of centrifuges, associated equipment, and raw uranium hexafluoride gas were secretly delivered to Libya through Khan's clandestine network. However, Libya's program remained rudimentary. By 2003, Libya had assembled only a small number of centrifuges for testing and had not produced any weapons-grade material. In short, Gaddafi's nuclear capability was technically limited and years away from yielding an actual bomb. Even so, the intent was there. Gaddafi hoped a nuclear arsenal would grant him security and regional clout. Western governments grew increasingly alarmed as evidence of Libya's weapons of mass destruction procurement efforts mounted. The geopolitical game changed dramatically after September 11th, 2001. The United States launched a global war on terror, and President George W. Bush famously lumped together regimes like Iran, Iraq, and North Korea as an axis of evil pursuing weapons of mass destruction. Libya, long a pariah for sponsoring terrorism, suddenly found itself squarely in Washington's sights as well. Gaddafi, ever the survivor, was keenly watching these developments. In March 2003, the United States and Britain invaded Iraq, toppling Saddam Hussein's regime. The swift collapse of Saddam, who had once boasted of weapons of mass destruction ambitions, sent a chilling message to Gaddafi. As a U.S. official later noted, the invasion of Iraq sends a message to Libya and other rogue states that pursuing weapons of mass destruction could invite disastrous consequences. Indeed, around that time, Libyan intermediaries quietly reached out to British and American officials, hinting that Tripoli might be ready to discuss giving up its weapons programs. Gaddafi saw the writing on the wall. If he remained on Washington's list of weapons of mass destruction-seeking, terrorism-sponsoring rogues, Libya could be the next target for regime change. His calculus evolved into a simple, stark choice: disarm and survive, or risk a war with the United States. Behind closed doors, Gaddafi began weighing his options. Throughout 2003, he sent signals that Libya was prepared to bargain. As U.S. Assistant Secretary of State John Bolton warned in mid-2003, Libya must forgo its weapons of mass destruction and missile programs if it wanted improved relations. The international pressure was mounting, and Gaddafi started to view his costly weapons of mass destruction programs not as assets, but as liabilities. In a February 2004 interview, reflecting on this period, Gaddafi admitted that clinging to banned weapons had brought Libya not security, but insecurity, and that abandoning these programs was in Libya's own interest and security. The shock and awe of the Iraq invasion and the specter of Libya's own fate, if it stayed on its weapons of mass destruction path, set the stage for a dramatic about-face by the Libyan regime. In December 2003, Colonel Gaddafi stunned the world with a surprise announcement. Libya would abandon all weapons of mass destruction programs and allow international inspectors to verify their elimination. This dramatic reversal came after months of secret diplomacy. Throughout 2003, even as the Iraq War raged, Libyan, American, and British negotiators held quiet talks in London and Tripoli. A deal was struck. Libya would fully dismantle its nuclear, chemical, and longer-range missile programs in exchange for rehabilitation into the international community. On December 19, 2003, Libya made its commitment public, pledging transparent cooperation and immediate inspections. What followed was a highly choreographed disarmament operation in early 2004. Teams of U.S. and British experts, along with the International Atomic Energy Agency, descended on Libyan facilities. Libya disclosed nuclear sites that few outsiders had seen and handed over sensitive equipment. In late January 2004, a U.S. Air Force cargo plane airlifted some 25 tons, 55,000 pounds, of Libyan nuclear and missile-related hardware and documents out of the country. This included assembled centrifuges, components for hundreds more, and even designs for an atomic bomb that Tripoli had acquired illicitly from AQ Khan. In a vivid show and tell, the ship materials were put on display at the Oak Ridge Nuclear Facility in Tennessee. Pipes, centrifuge casings, and bomb blueprints that until recently had been hidden in Libyan bunkers. Gaddafi's regime permitted full and transparent cooperation, in the words of British Prime Minister Tony Blair. Libyan officials answered inspectors' questions and even escorted them to previously secret sites. The disarmament deal was a landmark. Rarely had a state voluntarily surrendered weapons of mass destruction programs that it had long insisted it didn't have. In return for Libya's cooperation, the United States and United Kingdom offered diplomatic incentives. They stopped short of any formal security guarantee for Gaddafi, but they promised that Libya's good faith would be reciprocated. President Bush and Prime Minister Blair assured Tripoli that renouncing weapons of mass destruction would open the path to better relations and an end to Libya's isolation. Soon after Gaddafi's announcement, the United States and United Nations began lifting sanctions that had long choked Libya's economy. In early 2004, Libya signed key arms control treaties and allowed the removal or destruction of its entire nuclear infrastructure, chemical stockpiles, and longer-range missiles. Containers of enriched uranium fuel were flown to Russia for disposal. Scud-C ballistic missiles that Libya had obtained from North Korea were crated up and shipped to the United States for safekeeping. By all accounts, Gaddafi was keeping his end of the bargain. As one U.S. official put it, Libya had made itself a model for the cooperative return of an isolated state to the broader international community through verified disarmament. For a brief time, Gaddafi reaped the diplomatic rewards of disarmament. The lifting of sanctions and Libya's new status as a reformed regime opened the floodgates for foreign investment. Oil companies rushed back in. By 2004 to 2005, hundreds of millions of dollars in oil and gas contracts were signed with European and American firms, eager to tap Libya's vast petroleum reserves. In March 2004, British Prime Minister Tony Blair flew to Tripoli to meet Gaddafi, the first such visit in decades. The two men famously shook hands in Gaddafi's desert tent, a historic handshake symbolizing Libya's return from pariah status. Blair declared that Libya's December weapons of mass destruction pledge had made a new relationship possible, ending 3 decades of isolation. Other Western leaders followed. Italy's Silvio Berlusconi, France's Nicolas Sarkozy, and even U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice all paid visits to rehabilitated Tripoli in the ensuing years. Gaddafi, once the mad dog of the Middle East, as Ronald Reagan branded him, was now courted as an eccentric statesman. He was even allowed to pitch his Bedouin tent on state visits to European capitals, cutting a bizarre figure, but nevertheless being treated as a legitimate partner. In 2009, Gaddafi addressed the United Nations in New York after famously trying to set up his tent on Manhattan soil. The former outcast was now being greeted in world capitals, a remarkable turnaround made possible by his decision to give up Libya's weapons of mass destruction. However, beneath the veneer of international rehabilitation, Libya's domestic reality remained unchanged. Gaddafi's regime at home was as repressive as ever. There were no meaningful reforms to accompany the diplomatic opening. Gaddafi maintained his absolute grip on power, surrounded by his clique and security apparatus. The promised economic boom mostly enriched the dictator's family and loyalists, while average Libyans saw little improvement in their living standards. Corruption was rampant, as Libya's oil wealth remained concentrated in elite hands. The regime continued to trample human rights, imprisoning dissenters, censoring media, and violently crushing any hints of opposition. One stark example had occurred years earlier, in 1996, when over 1,200 political prisoners were massacred at Abu Salim prison. Under Gaddafi, such atrocities were never acknowledged, let alone addressed. This legacy of brutality festered. In the late 2010s, families of the Abu Salim victims and other activists began openly voicing grievances, only to face intimidation. Western governments largely looked past Gaddafi's domestic abuses during this period, focusing instead on the geopolitical success of Libyan disarmament. In public, Gaddafi basked in his newfound acceptance, hosting European leaders in Tripoli and cutting deals. In private, he kept a tight lid on Libyan society. Tony Blair later remarked that Gaddafi's fatal mistake was failing to reform internally. Libya became less of a threat to the outside world, but inside the regime was a threat to its people. Indeed, Libyans still had no freedom of speech or political rights, and the security services brooked no dissent. By 2010, Libya ranked near the bottom of global freedom indices, despite its foreign policy turnaround. The contrast was clear. Gaddafi's abandonment of weapons of mass destruction had earned him relief from international pressure, but it did nothing to loosen his authoritarian hold at home. Beneath the surface, calm, anger, and frustration among ordinary Libyans continued to simmer. In 2011, the storm of the Arab Spring swept through North Africa and the Middle East, shattering the status quo. It began in Tunisia, where a popular uprising toppled the longtime dictator in January. Then in Egypt, masses of protesters forced President Hosni Mubarak to resign in February. These seismic events inspired people across the region, including in Libya, to believe that their own tyrants could be overthrown. Decades of pent-up grievances in Libya suddenly burst into the open. In mid-February 2011, small protests in the eastern city of Benghazi, sparked in part by the arrest of a human rights lawyer and the memory of the Abu Salim prison massacre, quickly swelled into large demonstrations against Gaddafi's 42-year rule. Libyans, emboldened by the success of uprisings next door, took to the streets chanting for freedom and an end to the regime. Gaddafi's response was characteristically ruthless. His security forces opened fire on unarmed protesters, and his mercenaries and loyalist militias were deployed to crush the burgeoning revolt. The protests soon escalated into an armed uprising as regime violence led some military units and citizens to defect and take up arms. By late February 2011, eastern Libya, around Benghazi, had slipped out of Gaddafi's control, and rebel groups hastily formed an interim authority, the National Transitional Council. Gaddafi, however, remained defiant and entrenched in the capital Tripoli and parts of the west. He lashed out with fiery speeches on state television, vowing to hunt down the protesters like rats and cleanse Libya house by house of his opponents. The dictator dismissed the demonstrators as cockroaches and foreign-driven traitors, making clear he would shed rivers of blood rather than relinquish power. By March 2011, Libya had descended into open civil war. Gaddafi's forces, equipped with tanks and artillery, mounted a ferocious counteroffensive to reclaim rebel-held cities. Misrata, Libya's third-largest city, came under siege. In the east, Gaddafi's troops advanced toward Benghazi, the cradle of the uprising, with ominous threats to show no mercy. Cities like Benghazi and Misrata became battle zones, scenes of urban combat, civilian casualties, and desperate resistance by lightly armed rebels. The world watched with alarm as Gaddafi appeared poised to unleash a massacre in Benghazi, a city of 700,000, warning that protesters would be hunted down zenga zenga, meaning alley by alley. Facing the bloodiest crackdown of the Arab Spring up to that point, Libyan rebels and civilians pleaded for international help. The stage was set for a dramatic international intervention as Gaddafi's brutal campaign threatened humanitarian catastrophe. In March 2011, the international community moved from condemnation to action. The United Nations Security Council, invoking the responsibility to protect doctrine, approved Resolution 1973 on March 17, 2011, which authorized a no-fly zone over Libya and all necessary measures to protect civilians from Gaddafi's forces. This was a diplomatic green light for foreign military intervention. Within days, a coalition led by NATO began a bombing campaign to stop Gaddafi's onslaught. On March 19, French fighter jets soared over Benghazi to strike the vanguard of Gaddafi's army, which was at the city's gates. Soon, American, British, and other Allied aircraft joined in Operation Odyssey Dawn, later transitioning to full NATO command under Operation Unified Protection. Their mission, as mandated by the United Nations, was to protect Libyan civilians from imminent slaughter. Officially, the NATO intervention was limited to enforcing the no-fly zone and neutralizing forces that threatened civilians. In practice, however, it rapidly expanded into a de facto regime change operation. Coalition warplanes pounded Gaddafi's tanks, artillery, and command centers with increasing intensity. Night after night, airstrikes hit targets in Tripoli, including Gaddafi's own Bab al-Azizia compound. To the rebels, NATO effectively became their air force, obliterating the regime's heavy weapons and turning the tide of the conflict. By mid-2011, what began as a humanitarian mission had unmistakably aligned with the rebels' goal of overthrowing Gaddafi. Western leaders openly declared that Gaddafi must go, even though regime change was not explicitly in the United Nations resolution. Critics later argued that NATO had overstepped the United Nations mandate, using a limited civilian protection mission as cover for all-out intervention to topple the regime. This perceived bait and switch angered countries like Russia and China, who felt duped by the expansive NATO interpretation of Resolution 1973. For Gaddafi, the decisive factor was that he now faced a foreign military intervention without any deterrent. Unlike North Korea, which by this time had tested nuclear weapons, Gaddafi had voluntarily traded away his nascent weapons of mass destruction arsenal years earlier for diplomatic acceptance. He had no chemical or nuclear threat to wield as leverage against NATO intervention. As NATO jets relentlessly struck his forces, the contrast with other authoritarian regimes was not lost on observers. One U.S. security expert noted, had Gaddafi possessed nuclear weapons, it is highly unlikely the West would have dared intervene so directly in Libya's civil war. The regime in Pyongyang in particular was watching and drawing its own conclusions, as we will see in Scene 9. For now, the immediate reality was that NATO's involvement shifted the balance on the ground. Through spring and summer of 2011, rebel fighters, now with air cover and weapon drops from international supporters, went on the offensive. City by city, Gaddafi's grip weakened under pressure from the skies and rebel advances on the ground. The end came swiftly and brutally. By August 2011, rebel forces backed by intensive NATO airstrikes had pushed into Tripoli, overrunning Gaddafi's Bab al-Azizia stronghold. The dictator fled the capital as his regime collapsed. He became a fugitive in his own country, reportedly moving between loyalist pockets and desperately urging his supporters to fight on. The final stand took place in Sirte, Gaddafi's hometown, which loyalist fighters defended fiercely, even as they were encircled. On October 20th, 2011, as Sirte fell, Muammar Gaddafi was captured by rebel fighters. Dragged from a drainage pipe where he was hiding, the once all-powerful brother leader was beaten and taunted by a mob of young fighters. Within hours, in graphic scenes captured on cell phone videos, Gaddafi was dead, killed in captivity under still murky circumstances. His bloodied body was later displayed in Misrata for crowds to see. A grisly end for a man who had ruled Libya for 42 years. Gaddafi's death marked a symbolic and decisive end to his regime, but it also plunged Libya into a new and uncertain chapter. With the strong man gone, the loose coalition of rebel militias and returning exiles struggled to fill the vacuum. There was a fleeting moment of euphoria. Libyans celebrated the end of tyranny, and in October 2011, the country was declared liberated. Yet almost immediately, fissures and factionalism began to tear at the fabric of the new Libya. Gaddafi had hollowed out institutions and ruled by divide and conquer. Now without him, there was no easy way to knit the country back together. Former rebel brigades refused to disarm and instead carved out local fiefdoms. Competing militias clashed over turf, resources, and ideological visions for Libya's future. Within months, hopes for a stable democracy gave way to political chaos and sporadic violence. By 2012 to 2014, Libya descended into persistent disorder and eventually a new civil war. Governance was in shambles. At one point by 2014 to 2015, Libya had two rival governments, one in Tripoli and one in the east, each claiming legitimacy while militias ruled the streets. Public services broke down, the economy faltered despite oil wealth, and foreign powers began backing various proxies on the ground. The security vacuum also allowed extremist groups to rise. By 2014, jihadist militias had gained a foothold, and in 2015, the Islamic State, or ISIS, even seized the city of Sirte, though they were expelled the next year. What had begun in 2011 as a popular uprising morphed into years of instability and strife. As one analyst put it, ever since an international coalition led by NATO forces helped topple Gaddafi in 2011, governance in Libya has been in shambles, with rival militias and no political solution on the horizon. The hopes of the Arab Spring dimmed as Libya became a cautionary tale of a revolution gone awry, from a dictatorship into a failed state. The fall of Gaddafi sent shock waves far beyond Libya. The message was chillingly clear to other authoritarian regimes around the world. Never give up your WMD if you want to stay in power. Gaddafi's gamble, trading away his fledgling nuclear program for international acceptance, had earned him a few years of rapprochement, but it ultimately cost him his regime and his life. In the eyes of leaders like Kim Jong-un of North Korea, the Libyan case became the definitive cautionary tale. North Korean state media and officials explicitly cited the miserable fate of Muammar Gaddafi as proof that nuclear disarmament is a fatal error. Kim Jong-un watched the NATO intervention in Libya and Gaddafi's gruesome end, concluding that nuclear weapons were his insurance policy against a similar foreign intervention. Kim Jong-un does not want to end up like Gaddafi, overthrown with Western military assistance after giving up his nuclear weapons program, as one arms control expert noted bluntly. In 2018, when U.S. officials mused about applying the Libya model to North Korean denuclearization, Pyongyang's response was furious. They blasted the suggestion and warned they would never unilaterally disarm only to be invaded later. The North Koreans pointed out that Gaddafi made a deal to abandon his WMD and was rewarded with violent death 8 years later, an outcome they intend to avoid at all costs. Iranian leaders too took note. Though Iran's nuclear program and geopolitical situation differ from Libya's, hardliners within Iran have frequently invoked Gaddafi's fate as a warning. Look what happened to Libya, they argue. The West cannot be trusted. In fact, not long after Libya's collapse, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, stated explicitly that Iran would not bargain away its nuclear capability the way Libya did, because Gaddafi wrapped up all his nuclear facilities, packed them on a ship, and delivered it to the West, and see what they did to him. The lesson for Tehran's more skeptical faction was to be extremely cautious in trading nuclear leverage for promises. Even as Iran negotiated the 2015 nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, critics inside Iran warned about a Libya scenario. More broadly, the Libya episode dealt a blow to the global cause of non-proliferation by undermining the credibility of security assurances. In 2003 to 2004, the United States and the United Kingdom held out the prospect that if Libya disarmed, it would be safer and more integrated into the world. By 2011, that promise looked hollow. Libya was attacked despite doing all that was asked. As one scholarly analysis observed, after Libya's downfall, other states would be reluctant to follow Libya's example of unilateral disarmament. It had become painfully obvious that giving up weapons of mass destruction could make a regime more vulnerable, not less. The North Korean and Iranian governments hardened their resolve to develop deterrence, openly citing Libya as justification. In effect, Gaddafi's demise turned the Libyan model from a celebrated success into a taboo. No dictator wants to be the next Gaddafi. Gaddafi's gamble, betting that disarmament would guarantee his regime's security, is now remembered as a tragic miscalculation. His decision to abandon weapons of mass destruction did earn Libya short-term gains, a reprieve from pariah status, a few years of economic opening, and praise from world leaders. But in the long run, it paved the road to ruin. Stripped of any deterrent and facing a popular revolt, Gaddafi had no shield against NATO's intervention. He wagered his survival on the goodwill of the international community, only to be left fatally exposed when global politics shifted. In the end, Gaddafi's overthrow and violent death delivered a stark warning to others. As a former Libyan official ruefully observed, trusting the West's long-term commitment to stand by its deal can be a fatal mistake. The Libyan people, for their part, were left with anything but the freedom and prosperity they had dreamed of. The optimistic spark of the Arab Spring in Libya was snuffed out by years of infighting and instability. Libya remains fractured to this day, torn between rival governments in East and West, militias holding real power on the ground, and foreign powers meddling for influence. A country that once hoped to be a model of peaceful disarmament became instead a sobering example of state collapse and unintended consequences. On the international stage, the repercussions of Gaddafi's gamble are still felt. World leaders and diplomats grapple with the damaged credibility of disarmament agreements. When encouraging regimes like North Korea to give up nukes, the shadow of Libya looms large, a cautionary tale that is difficult to overcome. The norm of peaceful disarmament suffered a grievous blow in Sirte's desert sands. Gaddafi's fate has made it far harder to convince any ruthless leader that voluntarily relinquishing weapons will ensure their security. The legacy of Libya's story is thus a deeply conflicted one. It showed that even the most reviled regime can indeed be coaxed to disarm, a positive precedent in 2003. But it also showed how quickly that progress can unravel if underlying political issues are not resolved. Gaddafi's fall turned what was hailed as a non-proliferation triumph into a source of cynicism and never again resolve among other autocracies. In reflection, the saga of Libya raises profound questions. Was there a missed opportunity to stabilize Libya after 2003 and avert the 2011 nightmare? Could assurances to Gaddafi have been made or kept that might have changed his calculus when protests began? We may never know. What is clear is that Gaddafi's gamble has become a lesson written in ruin, one that scholars, strategists, and tyrants alike will study for years. The story encapsulates the promise and peril of disarmament in a world of realpolitik. For Libya, it brought a fleeting hope, followed by a descent into chaos. For Gaddafi, it meant a legacy defined not by his green book or grandiose titles, but by a cautionary chapter in the annals of history. And for the international community, Libya's experience stands as both a tragic warning and a challenge. How to prevent future Libyas and how to uphold the ideal that giving up the world's deadliest weapons should lead to peace, not a lesson written in ruin.